Go ahead and open your Bibles up to the book of Numbers. Last week we finished looking at the building of the tabernacle, its furnishings, its utensils, and we were told that they built all according to the pattern. And so now we're moving on into the book of Numbers, but we're actually going to skip forward to chapter 11. That said, let me give you a very quick rundown of the first 10 chapters so that you don't feel as though we've missed something. Chapter 1, there is a census that is taken. The number of fighting men available in Israel was 603,550. Chapter 2, we have the arrangement of the camp around the tabernacle. They built the tabernacle. There's a certain way they're supposed to be arranged around it, and so that is addressed in chapter 2. Chapter 3, there is the appointment of priestly duties. There are different families who are the sons of Aaron, and then so they each have different duties given to them. Chapter 4, there is a census of the Levites that is taken. They weren't in the general census because they're not fighting men. They are the priests, and so there's a separate census for them. Chapter 5, there's a number of various laws, and you find those back in Exodus as well. You'll find a reference to them in Deuteronomy, but some of the laws are mentioned again in chapter 5. Chapter 6 tells us about the Nazirite vow. And so somebody might take a vow to separate themselves to God in a special way, and this Nazirite vow is spoken of there. You can go and check chapter 6 to see all the conditions surrounding that. Chapter 7, the sanctification of the tabernacle. They needed to sanctify it in order to use it for the priestly service. That's in chapter 7. Chapter 8, the purification of the Levites. They need to be purified to go into a sanctified tabernacle. And so that happens there. Chapter 9, they're commanded to keep the Passover. Remember, the Passover was about to happen after they had just put together the tabernacle. Within the next 2 weeks, it was going to take place. And then chapter 10 talks about silver trumpets that were used to call the assembly together, and they were fashioned for that purpose. So that brings us to chapter 11. And really, the latter part of chapter 10, the people depart from Mount Sinai. It's time to move on. They've received the law. They've built the tabernacle, its furnishings, and its utensils. And so they're being led now by the Lord to the promised land. And these people had a lot of things that should promote faith and appreciation in them. Remember the plagues in Egypt that were against their captors, against those that enslaved them. They had the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that led them out of Egypt. They had the Red Sea crossing where the Lord parted the Red Sea and they passed through on dry land, whereas their enemies did not. The water from the rock, they got to a place where there was no water and God gave them water streaming out of a rock. They had used up the provisions they left Egypt with very quickly, and so they need food. God gave them manna from heaven every day except for on the Sabbath day. They had seen the cloud over Mount Sinai, the Lord's presence there before them as he gave the law. The voice of the Lord came forth from Sinai. The cloud then descended on the tabernacle after they had constructed it, and the cloud was now leading them on their journey. And so all these things, you would think that they would appreciate God and who he is and what he's doing for them. But despite all of this, the people still found opportunity to complain. And so that is really what we're focusing on in our lesson today is complaints. Chapters 11 and 12, there are a number of different complaints that take place. And so in chapter 11 and at verse 1, it says, "Now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, for the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. So the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some in the outskirts of the camp." We're not told immediately why they complained. It's in the text. We'll get to it. But it really doesn't matter why they complained. Here are these people who have God giving them direction and protection along the way, and yet they complain. Here are these people who have provision from God and a promise of a home from God, and yet they complain. And now they've complained in the past, and they've done different things in the past. Remember the golden calf incident as well. And God has been patient with them. This time he does not give them any warning. This time he hears their complaint, his anger is aroused, and he sends fire out among them. And it consumes those who are at the outskirts of the camp. I would suggest to you that his anger is still somewhat aroused from the golden calf incident. And remember, we had talked about it after the golden calf, that it didn't seem as though they had truly repented, because there they were, still wearing their ornaments and still wearing their robes of glory, those things that seem to be associated with the worship of that false calf. And so this time, he does not restrain his anger. He sends fire out amongst them. Verse 2, the people cry out to Moses. Moses prays to the Lord. The fire is quenched. And so they name the place in verse 3, Taberah, which literally means burning. They will remember that place says where several of them were burned to death because they complained against the Lord. Verse 4 through 6 reveal what the complaint was about. Take a look at it. It says, now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. We want some meat. Who's going to give us some meat to eat? We want, and it reveals who the instigators of this are. It says at the beginning of verse 4, the mixed multitude. Now remember who the mixed multitude are. When they came up out of Egypt, it wasn't just the people of Israel who came. You see, if you're a slave in Egypt and you see the things that are going on, this is the opportunity to get out. Who knows whether you belong with them or not? And who among the Egyptians is really caring whether you belong among them or not? And so a number of people from other nations who were slaves there would have joined themselves to Israel. And it's possible that some Egyptians who feel that they're being compromised in the land of Egypt as well, because remember, Pharaoh owns everything and everyone. They want out of that situation. They also would join themselves to Israel and leave. And so that's who these people are in verse 4. The mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense craving. They are the instigators of the complaint. But the people of Israel quickly take over, so the children of Israel also wept and said, who's going to give us something to eat? We want some meat. I can appreciate the frustration of having the same meal day after day. Do you remember when you were in college? If you went to college, maybe you did what some others have done. Rice, beans, or Kraft dinner. Those seem to be the staples. And not much else, right? And so, sure, having the same meal day after day might not be a desirable thing. But when they say, oh, all the fish we had back there, and the cucumbers, and the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic, and the oppression, and the hardship, and the beatings, did they forget about those other things? God is leading them to a land that flows with milk and honey. He's leading them to a land that when they send spies in, the spies are going to bring out grapes, and it's just huge. They're going to a prosperous land. Put up with it for a little while. Every day, God rains manna down from heaven for them. Learn how to cook it a bunch of different ways, right? But no, we want something else. Give us meat. That is the call. Give us meat. In verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was greatly aroused. Moses also was displeased. They keep moaning about it. Now, again, I think that this is the complaint of verse 1. You would think after the fire comes from the Lord and consumes a number of them, maybe they might stop it, but they still want it. And so it displeases the Lord. His anger is still aroused. It displeases Moses. I think displeased is likely an understatement on Moses' part. Verse 11 through 15. Moses has his own meltdown. And I can sympathize, I think we can all maybe sympathize with Moses. He's in an extremely tough position. Take a look at what he says. He's talking to God. He says, "Why have you afflicted your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to bear all these people alone because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, please kill me here and now. If I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." We have said at times in the past that Moses can be quite forward with the Lord. Anyone see themselves saying this kind of thing to the Lord? That's a little bit too forward, I think, for me. And yet, as we read through it, we understand there's some validity to the things that he's saying. This is too much. Keep in mind, he has gone to bat for these people with the Lord. There have been times when God was ready to destroy the entire nation. Moses, I'll restart with you. And Moses reminds God of his promise and that he needs to take the nation in. But now he's at his wit's end. Leading this people, look at the kinds of words that he's using about leading these people. It has become an affliction to them. He says to the Lord, it is a burden that is too great for me to bear. What's the problem? It's not that leadership is the problem. Moses is an exceptional leader. The problem is he's got a bunch of infantile people among him who are just immensely needy. They're not my children. Keep in mind, Moses raised 2 boys. We don't know if there were any other children besides that. He knows how to raise children. He doesn't know what to do with this nation. They're like a bunch of babies who won't stop crying even though I provide for them. But how am I supposed to provide this? This is unreasonable. They want meat. Where am I supposed to get meat? Now remember, we skipped over the first 10 chapters, but we did mention the census. 603,550 fighting men. Add to that, let's say that each of them is married. I know not all of them necessarily are, but just to round things off, so now we've got 1.2 million. The average family size in Israel was not like Canadian family sizes. We're used to 1.75 children in each family. That's not what they were used to. How many children did Jacob have? 13, right? And so we'll go conservative and we'll say maybe 4 or 5 children per family. The number has just shot up to somewhere around 4 million or so. And then we've got those who are elderly who are still among the people. And so not only the fighting men and their wives, but their parents as well. So you're looking at a nation of maybe 6.5 million people. Where do I get meat to feed 6.5 million people? Forget about one meal. They don't want just one meal. They want continuous meals. How do I do that? We're walking in the wilderness. It's not as though there's an excessive amount of meat available. So he simply tells the Lord, I can't bear it. This is more than one man should ever have to deal with. I think he's got a point. This is way too much. In fact, he says, if this is how it's going to be, I'm done. Just kill me now. The last time he made a statement of this magnitude, it was in defense of the people. Remember, he had gone to God in Exodus chapter 32, and he said, if you will not forgive their sin, then blot me out of your book as well. But now it's on the other side. Lord, I'm done with these people. If this is how it's going to be, just kill me now, because I don't want to see my wretchedness. Strong's defines this word that we've got translated as wretchedness a number of different ways. There's a bunch of words that could be bad, evil, adversity, affliction, calamity, displeasure, distress, grief, harm, heavy, hurt, ill, mischief, misery, naughty, sad, sore, sorrow, trouble, vex, wickedness, worse, wretchedness, or wrong. Take your pick. All of it's true. I think to a degree, part of what Moses is saying is, I can't deal with this distress anymore. This is too much grief. This is too much sorrow for one man to deal with. There's just too much trouble going on. But at the same time, I think he's also concerned with what is he going to do? How is he maybe going to respond to this? He's on the verge of losing it. And Lord, I don't want to see what I do if that's the case. He didn't want to act in a way that is unbecoming or that is evil, and yet he felt as though that's where he was headed because of the situation. Verse 16, God gives the answer. Here is the solution. Moses, gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. This is perhaps the basis upon which the Sanhedrin would later be established. The idea that there's 70 of the elders of the people, that's what the Sanhedrin was. Remember, Jethro had already set something like this up, a little bit more complex than this. There were leaders of tens and leaders of hundreds and leaders of thousands and so forth, and there was sort of a hierarchy system set up under Jethro. But it seems that that previous structure had fallen apart, because we're back to the point where Moses is dealing with everything, where Moses feels the pressure of the entire nation on him. And why would it have fallen apart? I wonder if some of those previous leaders had participated in the golden calf incident. You know, because it wasn't just your average low person who got the people stirred up and said, let's do this. You know, that's the kind of thing that comes from those who have a measure of authority or leadership. And so Moses, I want you to bring together 70 men, and they're going to help you. They will stand there with you. Verse 17, he goes on, he says, I will take of the Spirit that is upon you, and will put the same upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. I am going to grant my Spirit be upon them, just as my Spirit is upon you. They're going to share in this. Moses, you've got a problem. Here is the solution. It's the same solution Jethro had, but this one comes directly from God. Verse 18. They want that meat. And so the Lord's going to give it to them. You have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. We forget about the beatings and the oppression and servitude and all that stuff. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. Can you hear the cheers going up from the crowd? Yay, we're going to get meat. That's exactly what thank you, Lord. Friends, we need to be careful what we ask God for. Because he might just give it to us. I know a woman who prayed for persecution. And she found some, or it found her. We don't need to pray for stuff like that. It'll find us. Just go do the right things, go do God's will, and it'll find us. But she found some heavy persecution having prayed for it. We need to be careful what we ask the Lord for. They have asked for meat. Verse 19 and 20. The Lord says, I'm not going to give it to you one day. Yay! We didn't want it one day. We want it all the time. Nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month. Wouldn't you love to have a meal plan that's got meat in it for a whole month? You can just imagine they're all, woohoo, yay! Oh, no, they're excited about this. But now listen. I'm going to give it to you for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have despised the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come up out of Egypt? I wonder how many of them heard the whole message. I suspect a bunch of them stopped right after they heard this, but for a whole month. And then they just, a roar comes up from the crowd. Get sick of meat? Nah, not very likely. I understand that. I like meat. Most of our meals have meat. But this is not a blessing. This is a test. Are they going to yield to this craving, this intense craving, or do they actually pay attention to what God says? The latter part of that, verse 20, is sort of important. You're going to be sick of it. Verse 21 and 22 show how low Moses is at this point. Take a look at it. And Moses said, the people, he's speaking to God, the people whom I am among are 600,000 men on foot. Yet you have said, I will give them meat, that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, to provide enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, to provide enough for them? Moses doesn't understand, how can this be? I just don't know how we're gonna provide meat for that many people. And it's not 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, for a whole month. How are you gonna do that, Lord? Is that the same Moses who saw the Red Sea part Is that the same Moses who confidently walked into Pharaoh, who wants to kill him, but is too afraid to, and declares what the will of the Lord is? He's at a low point in his faith right here. Look at God's answer in verse 23. The Lord said to Moses, has the Lord's arm been shortened? Now you shall see whether what I say will happen to you or not. Moses, don't you remember the plagues back in Egypt? Don't you remember the parting of the Red Sea? Don't you remember the water coming out of the rock? Don't you remember the manna from heaven? Don't you remember my glory on Mount Sinai and over the tabernacle? I'm the same God. And so the Lord says, you'll see. The text breaks away from the people and comes back to the 70 elders who are supposed to help Moses. And we're told that the Spirit of the Lord rested upon them and they began to prophesy. Verse 25 reveals, though, that they never did so again. So they prophesied this one time and that was it. Now the thing is, not all of the 70 men were at the tabernacle when they were prophesying. 2 of them, Eldad and Medad, remained in the camp. And they prophesied there, verse 26 and verse 27. And now remember Joshua, right? Joshua is growing in faith. Joshua spent just about all of his time at the tabernacle. Moses would come and go from the tabernacle. Joshua stayed there. He is preparing himself to be a leader. And Joshua is concerned about this. He's upset because these men were prophesying off in the camp rather than prophesying at the tabernacle. And so he says, Moses, my Lord, forbid them. They shouldn't be doing this. They're not at the tabernacle. You know, this is similar to Mark chapter 9, where Jesus' disciples saw somebody who was casting out demons in Jesus' name. And we're told in the text that they forbade him because he's not following with us. He's not where we are. You remember when Jesus said, don't forbid him. He who's not against us is on our side. And Moses' response here is somewhat the same. Are you zealous for my sake? Oh, that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Joshua, we ought to glory in it while it's happening. Again, the end of verse 25, they never did so again. But not only that, think about Moses' response here. I wish all of God's people were prophets. Not just 70 for one time, but all of God's people. Wouldn't that be great? And even greater than that, oh, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Upon all of them. Understand the implication of his statement. The majority don't have the Spirit of God. He's not talking about a miraculous measure. He's not talking about prophesying. He's just saying they're not focused on God. Oh, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. He would gladly do without the former if he could just see the latter. No prophets in the land, but at least the people are focused on God and his will. They have been called by God. They are being led by God. But they had no room for God in their hearts. That is the generation that came out of Egypt. That's why all but 2 of them died in the wilderness, because they did not love God. Verse 31, now a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and left them fluttering near the camp about a day's journey on this side, and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. All right, time to get meat. And so quail is the dish of choice. They don't get to choose. God is the one who chooses. And so he brings quail for them, and it's everywhere. You don't have to go hunting for this quail. It's everywhere. He says that it is a day's journey on either side of the camp. Walk and go for a long walk, 6-7 hour walk. Guess what? You're still walking in quail. And it's not just, oh, there's one. It's, what do you say, 2 cubits deep? You know how deep that is? That's about 3 feet. 3 feet of quail. You're not walking. You're trudging along if you're able to move at all. Look at 32. The people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, gathering the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. He stayed up all day, all night, and all the next day gathering quail. You know, we want meat, right? Here's a lot of meat. Have you ever binged on something? Don't answer. Just keep that up in your mind. But maybe it's food, a gluttonous helping of food, and then you go back for a second one, right? And you know how it feels afterward. Your stomach is sore. Maybe it's hour after hour after hour of some TV series on Netflix. Maybe it's a video game through the day and through the night and through the next day. Some people even do it with work. Call those folks workaholics. They do nothing but work. That's what these people are doing. They are binging on quail. The least of them gathered 10 homers. We don't do measurements in homers. Let me give you a measurement that you might understand. We'll put it into bushels. The least of them gathered 62.5 bushels of quail. That's not the most. The guy who showed the most self-control among those who went out to gather quail, that's 62.5 bushels. What are you going to do with 62.5 bushels of quail? Can't eat that much. Look at verse 33. But while the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord wrath against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. Remember, this was a test. This was not God saying, oh, you want meat? Okay, here's meat. This wasn't them having asked God for it. This was them complaining and complaining and complaining and saying, we should have just stayed in Egypt. So it was a test. Will you listen to what God says, or will you yield to your craving? If they had listened to what God said, remember what his statement was. He said, not for 1 day, not for 2 days, not for 5, 10, 20, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to. Maybe at that point they realize, oh, we're not supposed to take this quail, this meat. Because you've despised the Lord and you've wept before him, saying, why did we ever come up out of Egypt? This is a test. Are you going to yield to your desires, to your cravings, or will you listen to the Lord? Those who yielded to the cravings and indulged themselves in the quail, they buried there. It's not just that they got a little bit sick and then they took some medicine and they were better. They buried them there. Verse 34, they call the place Kibroth Hattaavah, literally burying place of lust. It was a test. Are you going to yield to your desires, or are you going to yield to the Word of God? Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is disappointing. It begins with a couple of new complainers, sort of a surprise, Miriam and Aaron. We know who these are, right? This is Moses' sister and brother. They complain about Moses' wife. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. There's a couple schools of thought on this. First of all, the word Ethiopian, the Hebrew there is actually what would be translated Cushite, but it's neither here nor there. Ethiopia would be the area that would be considered Cush. Some believe this is a reference to Zipporah. Now, keep in mind, Zipporah is actually a Midianite, but Midian borders on Ethiopia, the general area of Cush. And so, though not specifically from Ethiopia, the term might be used in a derogatory way about her, maybe because of her dark skin. The second school of thought is that this is, in fact, another woman whom Moses married, who is from Ethiopia, and that perhaps she is part of the mixed multitude that had come up from Egypt with them. I haven't a clue which one it is. Doesn't really matter which one it is. The problem here, it may be that there is a racial bias on the part of Miriam and Aaron, though I suspect there's something else at work. Maybe they think that Moses has violated the law. Exodus chapter 34 forbade them from intermarrying with the people in the land of Canaan. I guess if somebody extends the principle, they could include Ethiopia, but it didn't forbid marriage of people from Ethiopia. But the real issue actually arises, this is a diversion, this is just something to get the conversation going. Because here's the real issue in verse 2. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? Moses, you're not the only prophet around here. You're not the only one that God has talked to. Both Aaron and Miriam have prophesied. Aaron, while he was in the land of Egypt, was prophesying. Miriam, after they came up on the other side of the Red Sea, she was prophesying. And so what they're doing is they're accusing Moses of taking too much authority for himself. Did they not hear what happened in chapter 11? Moses was like, take some of this away. It's not that Moses is grabbing it all up and he's hoarding authority for himself. The grievance about the Ethiopian woman, that's not the true axe here. It's about authority. Verse 3 is interesting. It says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. You know, we often cite this and speak about Moses' humility, and you know, that's what it says, right? The Hebrew word here is omnav. It can mean humble, as is translated in most translations. It can also mean depressed or lowly. He is the leader of a nation of complainers, several of whom have recently died because of their lack of self-control. He was so down on things that he asked God to take his life if things didn't change. And now his own siblings are turning on him. Is Moses the most humble man on the face of the earth? I'm not saying that he's not. But it could be that this verse is saying he's the most depressed man on the face of the earth. This is a low time for Moses. Verse 4, God calls them all to him. Come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting. You, and you. Moses, Aaron, Miriam, I want to see you all. And I wonder if Aaron and Miriam perceived that this meant the Lord agreed with that. Okay, we're going to get our measure of authority. Verse 5, the two of them are called to approach the Lord even closer. Okay, good. This is going low. Uh-oh. Hang on, verse 6. Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? I understand you two have prophesied. Guess what? You prophesied because I gave it to you. That's the only way that a prophet prophesies, is when God gives it to them. He says, Moses isn't like that. Moses doesn't have to rely upon me giving something to him and then he reveal it to the other people the same way you two do. Moses actually talks to me face to face. The relationship Moses has with God exceeds far above the relationship that Aaron and Miriam have with God. He says, I speak to Moses plainly. I may not do that with you. I use dark sayings with him. I might do that with the prophets. In fact, he sees the form of God. Which of you were on Mount Sinai and saw God walk by? You ought to have been afraid to speak to Moses that way. Verse 9, the anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. And then what we find immediately is Miriam has leprosy. The Lord departs, and Miriam is struck with leprosy. Why Miriam and not Aaron? It's possible that Miriam was the aggressor in this dispute. Her name does appear first throughout the text. It's also possible that Aaron was not struck with leprosy in order to preserve the priesthood. Aaron being struck with leprosy could bring reproach and contempt on the priesthood right at its very beginning. That would be a bad thing. And so which of those was it, or both of those, we don't know for certain. But Miriam has leprosy. Verse 11 and 12, Aaron immediately begins to plead with Moses on behalf of his sister. Verse 13, Moses cries out to the Lord and asks that he heal her. Understand, Moses has a tender heart. And these are his siblings. He acknowledges wrong has been done, but he feels for her. And here's God's response. If her father had spit in her face, would she not be shamed 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp 7 days. And afterwards she may be received again. Moses, you're too soft on her. If she were a child and had severely provoked and disobeyed her father, great shame would have been brought upon her. She has despised the Lord's servant. And she does have leprosy. And so let her go sit for a week. And so verse 15, she spent the week 7 days outside of the camp. Their travel plans were delayed so they could wait for her. And then they will pick up camp and go on their way again. All right, let's close this up. Our time is gone. A few lessons for us out of the text. First of all, we need to stop complaining. It is inconsistent with being a child of God. Philippians 2, verse 14 and 15, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights. If we are complaining, we're not shining as lights. If we're complaining, then we're not setting ourselves apart from a crooked and perverse generation. If we're complaining, then we are not children of God without fault. We're not blameless and harmless. We need to not complain. We don't have the time to read it, but go read it yourself at some point. 1 Corinthians 10, first 11 verses. He talks about this generation of Israel, and the complaining comes into play in that. Paul says we need to learn from them not to do the same kind of thing. We need to stop complaining. We need to not reminisce about bondage. You realize that's what they were doing? Man, Egypt was so good. Oh, the fish, cucumbers, the leeks, all the good stuff in Egypt. Did they forget that they were slaves there? They were slaves with no hope. At times, I have heard Christians reminisce about the days before they were a Christian, before they knew Christ. And now there's some things that are neither here nor there, but there are some things that we've got no business reminiscing and wanting to just latch onto. Anything that has alcohol or drug use involved in it. Oddly enough, I've heard a Christian reminisce about the good old days when that kind of stuff was going on. Anything that had fornication or fun in the midst of bad company, which is bad fun. Horse jesting or whatever it be. We need to be careful not to yearn for the good old days because they were spiritually destitute days. Equally, don't glory in excess and the fulfillment of our lust. That's what we saw take place at the end of chapter 11. Many did in Moses' day, and they lost their lives. Those who are in leading roles among God's people, whether it be Moses in Israel, whether it be elders or evangelists or teachers, there is a measure of stress that goes with such. I took a vacation at the end of March. Do you know why? It was stress related. I needed a little bit of time away. I'm not saying y'all are stressful. It's just there's a measure of stress that goes with that kind of role. And so it's important to be aware of that and to be appreciative and to support and to work together. That's what Moses was looking for. He felt alone. And he wanted to have somebody to share these challenges with. It wore him out. And so he needed some help. We need to pray for and lift up those who serve in the Lord's kingdom. Be concerned for those who serve in some manner of leadership role. And then finally, don't seek our own glory. That's what Miriam sought, and she spent a week outside the camp as a leper. We all have a place in the kingdom. Some are going to be more visible than others. We need to be sure that we're not seeking our own glory, but the Lord's glory. Whether we stand behind a pulpit or whether we sweep floors. Doesn't matter. We're equal before the Lord, regardless of so long as we're serving the Lord. And so as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, we need to let our light shine in such a way that men are going to see our good works, glorify the Father. Whatever those good works are, it always brings back the glory of God, not the glory of self.